What's going on, folks? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. So there's no doubt that the midterm election was a painful example of how political apathy among the vast majority of Americans allowed Washington to maintain the status quo. Yet again. In fact, only 36.4% of eligible voters showed up to the polls last Tuesday, representing the lowest turnout figure since World War II. Of course, with a multi-billion-dollar campaign system firmly in place, no one really expected this year's election to elicit mass change from the top down. When you peel back the layers of absurd campaign ads, insidious gerrymandering, and voter suppression tactics, this election may have just been one of the most revolutionary in recent history, at least on a local level. And perhaps nowhere was that more apparent than in the world's eighth largest economy, California, where voters just passed Proposition 47, 20 years after the three strikes law went into effect, which will result in the release of at least 10,000 inmates across the state. See, California spends nearly $10 billion a year on a prison system that incarcerates roughly 120,000 prisoners. And given that in years past, the state has passed some of the most stringent sentencing laws in the nation, insane overcrowding continues to plague its jails. But as RT's LA correspondent Lindsay France explains, that might all be about to change.
This would essentially defelonize nonviolent drug offenses. We're talking not just, marijuana and cocaine, we're talking heroin and methamphetamine as well. Its aim is really to empty out these overcrowded prisons and deal with the problem in a different way, preferably a more medical way. Not only that, but it defelonizes nonviolent property crimes and theft under $950. So what it will do is take the difference that is saved from housing all of these people in prison and take it and turn it into social programs that can be used, such as mental health counseling, drug and alcohol counseling, truancy counseling for people who are still in school to change the problem. And what's interesting here is that this was put together by a coalition of people from a vast array of backgrounds. We're talking conservative Christians, civil libertarians, liberals. We're talking people from all sorts of political philosophies, religious philosophies, saying, look, this $9 billion we're spending a year on our prison programs isn't working. We're going to change it. And that's what they did.
So in light of California's huge leap forward in attempting to end America's addiction to incarceration, we'll be dedicating today's show to exploring the fundamental issues facing a country with 5% of the world's population and 25% of its prisoners. Now let's break the set.
Speculation has been replacing hard fact.
Terrorists don't read Twitter.
Who's right and who's wrong?
It was a terrible thing to say, period.
The mistake entirely on me.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. These words are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set.
Other than the war on drugs, perhaps nothing explains the exponential rise of America's inmate population than the private prison industry. Incarceration has become more profitable than ever, bringing in billions of dollars from dirt cheap labor every year. And now even services at publicly run prisons are being privatized. Look no further than JPay, a company that works with public and private prisons alike to provide a digital way for friends and family members to transfer money to inmates. But a 6-month investigation by the Center for Public Integrity reveals just how costly the system is for those impacted by the prison industrial complex. So joining me now to discuss is the reporter who broke the story, Daniel Wagner. Thank you so much for coming on, Daniel.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
So start by outlining how JPay's business model operates.
Well, so JPay relies on the fact that inmates' families need to send them money for a growing list of things that used to come for free. So toiletries, winter clothes in places that are very cold, lots of fees that people get charged, things like electricity. All of these things cause an inmate to need money. Now, if you're a family member on the outside, someone who's never done anything wrong yourself, you want to support your relative. In order to do so, you need to go through a company like JPay these days in order to get them money. So what JPay's done is, in essence, it's erected a sort of a virtual toll booth standing at the gates to the prison, and they take a slice. Each time families send money, which is usually once a month, small quantities, 4 people we're talking about, they just take a cut of that money and often share it with the prison system itself.
And you've done an extensive investigation on JPay and the impact that it has on communities that are impacted by the prison industrial complex. Explain what those findings were.
Well, in essence, what we found is it's much more difficult for people to make their way out of poverty in a situation where it's not just JPay, but the entire system of prison vendors that are fed by JPay. So the folks that operate the prison stores, the folks that operate the prison phones, all these other things that the money is going towards are things that are coming out of the pockets of people who really can't afford it. So, I mean, it's an incremental bit. It's a, it's a $5 fee here and an $8 fee there. But at the end of the day, what ends up happening is people are stuck in poverty.
And the CEO of JPay, Ryan Shapiro, has said, I'm only making a sliver, razor-thin profits. What is your response to that claim?
Well, Ryan did make a lot in our interviews of how small his profit margins are compared with, say, the phone companies or the commissary companies. But the fact of the matter is, it's a for-profit company. It's making tens of millions of dollars a year. Last year, they transmitted upwards of $1 billion, or actually, I think that's this year. Their projection was $1 billion. So it's not just some sort of rinky-dink corner operation. This is a company that has access to 70% of U.S. Offenders. It's like 1.7 million people using JPay to send money. So it's really not as little money as someone might think.
And you mentioned that, a lot of people are using this, and it's kind of obviously the easiest system to facilitate transferring funds. Are there other options? And if so, why don't prisoners use wire transfers or I don't know, checks, things like that?
Well, so the old system was that people sent checks and they sent money orders to their incarcerated relatives. They were credited a lot more quickly than JPay tends to credit them. And in a lot of states, JPay will still accept a money order by mail. Now, a lot of the families I spoke to said that they could be delayed for days, weeks at a time, sometimes even months. And the other issue with the money orders is in some states there are still fees to deposit a money order. Some states don't take money orders at all. So when you're talking about such a vast population, again, 1.7 million people with links to JPay, it's really, it's not a satisfying answer to hear this pocket and that pocket have a free way to send when everybody else has to go through the toll booth.
Right, especially when you're facing weeks potentially for those funds to get in the hands of your loved ones. You mentioned this briefly before, but of course supporters of the private industry will say this money is mostly used to buy junk food, unnecessary items. What's the big deal, I guess, if inmates aren't getting access to that?
Well, I think a lot of people don't realize how much money inmates need. And I mentioned all these necessities that they're being charged for, toothpaste and soap and so on. But there's also doctor's visits. I mean, there's also transportation. There's also all kinds of health care, people paying for their own medical devices. And prison systems will say to you, oh, well, we have sort of a system in place for indigents, for people who don't get money transferred in. But the fact is, the system is they create a debt on the person's account. So people run up negative account balances and are unable to receive money in order to buy those winter clothes until they've paid down the debt they incurred by going to the doctor.
I just can't. It's hard for me to wrap my mind around accumulating a debt when you're in prison.
Yeah.
You're already working at kind of slave labor wages to make God knows what. I know Army equipment and stuff like that as well, which you mentioned in your report. Talk about how this is so successful. What are JPay's marketing initiatives, their lobbying force in Washington? How has this been able to happen?
Well, so there are a few keys to this. One major piece is spending at corrections conventions. Now, JPay is not unique in this, but JPay has thrown lavish parties for corrections agencies that are able to contract with it. So they take that money that they're extracting from families, which is their corporate profit in their mind, and they throw all-night parties with tequila and mariachi bands and hand-rolled cigars to impress the guys. That's one part of it. In a lot of states, they've hired lobbyists. In Washington, they've hired lobbyists in an effort to gain the access to the federal system, which is the biggest prison system in the country, although smaller than many people think by comparison. So they've got lobbying, they've got parties, and then they've also just got really aggressive marketing to families. So if you're a family in a state that JPay takes over money transfers in, you are unable to avoid messages that say, put down your pen, put down your car keys, there's a better way to do this, go to our website, call us up, and use the high-fee option, in essence. And there are even flyers that are being distributed in prison visiting rooms where there are people who are crying and despairing because their money order was mishandled. Now, what's never mentioned is JPay is the concern that's handling those money orders. So if those people are so upset about what happened, it's probably JPay's fault.
Oh my God, it's unbelievable. And it's not just JPay. I mean, it's so many other forces at work here. What are some other major private companies that use the same kind of exploitation?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I don't want to make it sound like JPay is the only player here. There is a massive company out of St. Louis called Centric Group, whose subsidiaries include Keith and Access Corrections, and they have a division that accepts payments. Aramark, the food service giant, which also, as we know, works in prisons and schools and so on, they have a payments acceptance division. But really what it is all of these companies that are focused on monetizing the experience of incarceration. And, you know, they make theirs and they offer a value proposition to the states or to whoever's running the prisons. I mean, it's an entire multi-billion-dollar universe. JPay is merely the gateway for so many people into that universe of other costs and other vendors enriching themselves.
I wanted to bring up another aspect of this, which is we've seen in the past, probably the most egregious example was the judge in Pennsylvania that received millions of dollars in kickbacks from private prisons in order to send juveniles to jails. An incredible story here, although that was a few years back. How worried should we be about the ties between the private prison industry and those working within the judicial system?
Well, I mean, I think that anytime you have a sort of a potential for conflict of interest, such as the one you described, obviously it needs to be looked at very closely. I don't purport to be an expert on the private prison industry, and that's certainly not you know, what my report was focused on, but I do want to mention, because you mentioned the word kickbacks, that a key part of the business model for all of these vendors is what critics call kickbacks and what they call profit or revenue sharing. And what that is taking a piece of the profits that they earn from selling goods to inmates or doing the money transfers and returning it to the prison system so that the prison systems can continue to sustain and enlarge themselves. So really what you have is everybody's interests aligned except for the inmates and their families.
Right, and I guess why should people who have never been incarcerated, who don't know anyone who's incarcerated, why should they care about JPay and this whole kind of bribery going on?
Well, I mean, I won't take your words into my mouth, but why they should care about mass incarceration is because mass incarceration is incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
You know, the points of all of these financial structures in terms of, you know, the electronic transfer is handled by a private company or whatever, the idea is always let's take costs off the back of the state government, let's shift costs onto the families and onto the individuals. You can do that as much as you want. You can do that all year, but at the end of the day, the state is still paying far, far more to incarcerate people. So if people really care about stewardship of their taxpayer dollars, they should be asking, do we have a prison system that's focused on rehabilitation? Do we have a prison system that has funding to do substance abuse treatment and other things that can help people to get back on their feet when they get out, instead of handing them a debit card from JPay that deducts massive fees?
And I think that the answer is pretty clearly no. Thank you so much for helping shed light on this incredibly important issue. Daniel Wagner, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Coming up, I'll take a look at one country's prison system that's completely redefining the notion of incarceration. Stay tuned.
You know that guy who wishes someone would spy on him? How about the woman who enjoys being lied to by her government? This citizen can't get enough congressional inaction, and this taxpayer wants the mainstream media to be more corporatized. While this person would rather eat genetically modified food, this one thinks our prisons are not crowded enough. And what do these people have in common? They don't exist.
Most people think to stand out in this business, you need to be the first one on top of the story or the person with the loudest voice or the biggest ratings. In truth, to stand out in the news business, you just need to ask the right questions and demand the right answers. Question more.
Out of the 2.2 million people currently behind bars in the U.S., many live in abysmal conditions that international bodies have deemed human rights violations. Not only are people put in solitary confinement as punishment for minor offenses, but even standard cells are subject to incredibly harsh environments. Earlier this year, a homeless veteran at Rikers Prison in New York actually baked to death in a cell that exceeded 100 degrees due to a broken heater. His crime? Sleeping in public to seek shelter from the cold. His penalty apparently was to die alone from pure neglect. Also in Texas, at least 14 inmates have died since 2007 due to extreme heat. According to a report by the University of Texas Human Rights Clinic, 90 degrees is a common temperature for inmates to be living in, but can reach upwards of 130 degrees in the summer. The report alleges that the dangerous heat levels, quote, violates individuals' human rights, particularly the rights to health, life, physical integrity, and dignity. Furthermore, there's no maximum temperature guidelines for inmate housing, despite other corrections institutions doing so across the country. As such, a group of prisoners have taken to suing the state multiple times to force a change in conditions, and even a group of correctional officers have joined their case. According to the Wall Street Journal, they were driven to do so after learning that the state spent $750 grand in June to buy 6 new barns with exhaust fans and misters to cool pigs raised for inmate consumption. Yes, prisoners are treated worse than the hogs they consume. In fact, Texas has extremely strict rules on keeping pig farms cool while treating prisoners like vermin who deserve to be baked alive. Not to mention that the majority of these inmates are serving time for nonviolent drug offenses. This is compounded by the fact that there are 10 times more mentally ill people in prisons than state psychiatric hospitals. But at least this hardline approach to criminal justice is working, right? At the very least, it's deterring people from committing crimes. Well, actually, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, recidivism rates are stunningly high. In fact, 70 to 80% are rearrested and thus reincarcerated within just 3 to 5 years after being released. Look, we have a major problem here with no political will to solve it. If only there was an example we can look to that could show us how prisons could actually be humane and rehabilitate prisoners instead of prepping them up for a life of more crime and disenfranchisement. Which brings us to Norway. See, the video you're looking at now isn't of college dorm rooms. They're typical accommodations in Norwegian prisons, a system considered one of the most humane in the entire world. And one of the facets that may be disconcerting to Americans is the emphasis Norway has on the reintegration of prisoners into society. Since life sentences don't exist in the country, the main focus is to get to the root of what drives the crime in the first place, opening a real relationship and dialogue between guards and inmates. According to Time, the guard's official job description says they must motivate the inmate so that his sentence is as meaningful, enlightening, and rehabilitating as possible. So they frequently eat meals and play sports with prisoners. There are no bars on the windows. There are jogging trails and even a guest house for inmates' families to stay in while they visit. So how would such a posh environment deter people from crime? Well, Norway's recidivism rates are among the lowest in the world, sitting at just 20%, a far cry from here in the land of incarceration. Look, this isn't about providing luxury goods for people who have committed crimes. It's about treating human beings with respect and dignity. Far too often, people are thrown into jail for decades to life with no hope of ever getting out. These people deserve a chance to turn their lives around. Why? Because it works. You might be surprised to learn that since 1986, there's been a 400% increase in the female incarceration rate, including an 800% increase for black women, according to the Sentencing Project. And while there's no doubt that mass incarceration touches millions of Americans alike, the exceptional rise in female imprisonment in particular means that the U.S. now holds a third of all the women prisoners worldwide. But one woman and former criminal defense attorney turned inmate is trying to change that. In 2009, Andrea James was disbarred and sentenced to 24 months in prison for misappropriating her client's funds. But ever since, she's become a huge advocate for prison reform with her organization, Families for Justice is Healing, and has also written a book entitled Upper Bunkies Unite, and other thoughts on the politics of mass incarceration. Andrea joined me earlier, and I started by asking her how the huge gender disparity among prison guards affects the female prison population.
If you look at the profile of women, federal, state, county, women who are incarcerated, their profiles are extraordinarily similar in a lot of ways. Women are mostly what I describe as victim offenders. These are women who have struggled with a lifetime of sexual abuse, domestic violence, leading to the illness of addiction, and a number of things that have been untreated traumas throughout their lives. Much of that is in relation to poor and abusive relationships with men. And when those things go untreated, and our response to that, you know, is to incarcerate women for things that women should never be in prison for. Prison is an incredibly dehumanizing place. And then you add to that that we've tried to accommodate a military-industrial complex by hiring former veterans from the military to fill the jobs in prisons, and many of them, the majority of them being men. And you have an environment in a prison which is not about healing people and being conducive to treating people like human beings. Then you allow a situation where you have men in a prison with women who are struggling with lifetimes of untreated trauma, usually as a result of mistreatment by men. So it's incredibly further debilitating for women to be in that sort of environment. I mean, in the women's prison that I was in Danbury, Connecticut, we had the majority COs were males, and they had free reign of the prison, which means they walked unannounced through our living quarters at any time, into our bathrooms, into our shower areas, and there was nothing we could do about it. So, and because of the fact that, you know, prison being so dehumanizing does not impact the incarcerated people in those prisons. It impacts the people that work there as well. You know, we had an alarming rate of corrections officers at Danbury that committed suicide, you know, and alcoholism was prevalent. And it was not unusual for male officers to come on the late shifts from 11 to 7, those shifts where women would be sleeping and the prison would be dark. And though you would, you know, smell the odor of alcohol on these men who were male guards, and that was incredibly difficult for many of the women who were dealing with a lot of the trauma from abuse that they had received.
Andrea, I wanted to move on to voting disenfranchisement. The ACLU estimates that nearly 6 million Americans cannot vote due to felony convictions or being on parole simply. I mean, how are these laws even constitutional, considering that these people are American citizens that have every right to participate?
We put people who have been incarcerated in this box, and we say that, you know, you have lost all resemblance of being a human being and having other reasons why you should be instilled with the right to vote. Even if you're incarcerated, you have a lot of reasons why you should maintain your right to vote. You have children, you have families that you've left behind, you have communities that you still care about that need your voice, and you're precluded from doing that. And then they extend that by disenfranchising you for life. We've got 4 million black men in this country right now who have been permanently disenfranchised from the right to vote. Those 6 million people that you referred to include everybody, and they would have dramatically swayed the recent elections that you know, of who would run the Senate, for instance, in this country. So when we start to take those rights away from people, we're doing some incredible damage, not to mention that for black people, you know, who are majority of incarcerated still, you know, those folks, us as African Americans in this country, the Voting Rights Act is not this, you know, permanent act. It's a right that's bestowed upon people, and it's voted in every 25 years, okay? It's extended, as we say. So that's a concern, because if we keep going down this, you know, this craziness of finding these really arbitrary, ridiculous ways to incarcerate poor people of color, we may very well find ourselves in some years unable to get enough people to make sure that right, that Voting Rights Act, is actually extended.
Well, I don't understand why this isn't more of a central tenet for a lot of people pushing for election reform, because this is, I mean, we're talking about millions of people here who have completely lost one of the most innate rights to participate in the electoral process here. As you said, it could significantly, you know, change electoral outcomes here. Who is behind these laws? Because Florida, Kentucky, and Iowa have outright bans on anyone who's been charged with a felony. I mean, do you know any interests that are specifically pushing these, and how can we repeal them?
Well, sure. I mean, for instance, one of the groups that has been extraordinarily instrumental in pushing all of these things that have created so much social injustice in this country is the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's a group of very, far-right people with an agenda that is about incarceration. It's an agenda that is about voter disenfranchisement. It is an agenda that created the Stand Your Ground laws. It's an agenda that has disenfranchised and depleted the funding for public education. It has committees that are private prison committees. It's funded by the NRA. It's funded by private prisons. It's funded by big money. And it brings together with major, corporations with a lot of money, very conservative legislators from across this country, and they help to model legislation and farm it out across the country. And too often things get supported that we're not even aware of until it's already a done deal.
Your organization, Families for Justice and Healing, was started in the yard of the Women's Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. As you mentioned, the prison now made famous, of course, by the show Orange is the New Black. I mean, obviously that's a fictionalized look at prison, but how do shows like that or the media in general help or hurt the public image of incarceration?
Well, listen, Piper Kerman is our sister. She's a woman who wrote about her experience. We love Piper. She's one of us, and we applaud her for writing her book, Orange is the New Black. The Netflix series, quite honestly, is a series that was created for entertainment. So when you kind of cross that line, and you start creating things for entertainment, you inevitably distort the voices of the real women and the real experiences of those women. The majority of women who are incarcerated in the prisons across this country are predominantly poor women of color. They aren't really stories that, although these women many of them have tried to get the true stories out about how incarceration has impacted poor women of color, have not been received. Nobody seemed to really pay attention to it until Orange is the New Black. So in that respect, it was huge. It's gotten a lot of people paying attention to this.
Thank you so much, Andrea James, author, prison reform activist. Amazing to have you on.
Thank you for allowing us this opportunity. We're very grateful. Thank you.
Thanks so much for watching, you guys. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at Abby Martin. Join me tomorrow when I break the set all over again.
Yeah, prisoners, you call it aggressive, but all I see is lies coming out in your message. I keep it audacious, speaking the facts. We break the paradigm with truth and facts. The people don't need to be fed propaganda, spoon-fed fabrication.
Speculation has been replacing hard fact.
Terrorists don't read Twitter.
Who's right and who's wrong?
It was a terrible thing to say, period.
The mistake entirely on me.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. These words are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set.
Other than the war on drugs, perhaps nothing explains the exponential rise of America's inmate population than the private prison industry. Incarceration has become more profitable than ever, bringing in billions of dollars from dirt cheap labor every year.
For people who are still in school to change the problem. And what's interesting here is that this was put together by a coalition of people from a vast array of backgrounds. We're talking conservative Christians, civil libertarians, liberals. We're talking people from all sorts of political philosophies, religious philosophies, saying, look, this $9 billion we're spending a year on our prison programs isn't working. We're going to change it. And that's what they did.
So in light of California's huge leap forward in attempting to end America's addiction to incarceration, we'll be dedicating today's show to exploring the fundamental issues facing a country with 5% of the world's population and 25% of its prisoners. Now let's break the set. Overcrowding continues to plague its jails. But as RT's LA correspondent Lindsay France explains, that might all be about to change.
This would essentially defelonize nonviolent drug offenses. We're talking not just, marijuana and cocaine, we're talking heroin and methamphetamine as well. Its aim is really to empty out these overcrowded prisons and deal with the problem in a different way, preferably a more medical way. Not only that, but it defelonizes nonviolent property crimes and theft under $950. So what it will do is take the difference that is saved from housing all of these people in prison and take it and turn it into social programs that can be used, such as mental health counseling, drug and alcohol counseling, truancy counseling.
As insidious gerrymandering and voter suppression tactics, this election may have just been one of the most revolutionary in recent history, at least on a local level. And perhaps nowhere was that more apparent in the world's than in the world's 8th largest economy, California, where voters just passed Proposition 47, 20 years after the 3 strikes law went into effect, which will result in the release of at least 10,000 inmates across the state. See, California spends nearly $10 billion a year on a prison system that incarcerates roughly 120,000 prisoners. And given that in years past, the state has passed some of the most stringent sentencing laws in the nation, insane